It was a quiet morning at the Hillside police station, in the heart of Texas. The coffee slowly cooled on Mike Peterson's desk as the sergeant sifted through piles of reports. The stillness was almost numbing, typical of a place where serious crimes were rare. But something strange was about to break this calm. Outside, a sharp, persistent bark echoed at the station's entrance. Mike glanced up with a curious expression but didn't immediately get up. The town was full of stray dogs, and a bark wasn't cause for alarm. However, the sound continued, almost as if it were pleading for help. Finally, he pushed his chair back and walked to the door. When he opened it, Mike was met with a sight that left him speechless. A golden retriever stood there, panting, with eyes filled with what seemed like fear and urgency. Between her teeth, she gently held a small puppy, motionless and fragile. Her steps were hesitant, as if every movement was a struggle. He crouched slowly, trying not to startle her. "Hey, girl, what's going on?" Mike murmured, using the softest tone he could muster. The dog carefully placed the puppy on the ground and immediately let out a low, hoarse bark, as if begging him to understand. Before he could react, she turned and bolted out the open door, leaving the puppy vulnerable at the officer's feet. Mike felt a chill run down his spine. Something was deeply wrong. He quickly called Sarah Mills, who was on the other side of the room. When she arrived, her expression shifted from exhaustion to clear concern as she saw the little puppy. "What happened?" Sarah asked, crouching down to examine the pup. "I don't know, but I think she's coming back," Mike replied, his eyes fixed on the door. And she came back. The dog reappeared, this time with another puppy, just as fragile and scared. With every new return, the desperation in Harley's eyes seemed to grow. Until, on her fifth trip, she staggered into the station, exhausted. Sarah tried to pet her, but Harley let out a low whimper, struggling to get up and run back to the door. "Wait!" Sarah shouted as she grabbed her coat. "Something's not right, Mike. We have to follow her." "I agree. This isn't normal," he replied, already grabbing the patrol car keys. The two carefully placed the puppies in the back seat and followed Harley, who was running down the street with determination, despite her obvious exhaustion. Sarah's heart raced as the surroundings became more and more isolated. They were heading toward a dangerous area on the outskirts of the city. As they moved forward, Mike broke the silence. "If she came to the station, it's because she had no one else to turn to. Whatever it is, we need to be ready." When Harley suddenly stopped in front of an old cabin, partially hidden by vegetation, both of them felt a chill. The dog looked at them, as if begging them to understand. Sarah slowly got out of the car, her hand instinctively resting on the gun holster. "Something tells me what we're about to find here is going to be hard to forget," Sarah said, quietly. Then, Harley let out a long, desperate howl, echoing through the silent surroundings. Want to know the outcome of this emotional story? Then hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. That way, you'll stay updated on all the details and won't miss any of our amazing upcoming stories. The cabin looked like it had been abandoned for years. The peeling paint and dirty windows were a dark contrast to Harley's golden shine as she continued to howl in desperation. Sarah and Mike stopped in front of the entrance, exchanging a look of hesitation. The place had a heavy energy, as if it hid secrets that preferred to remain unrevealed. Harley stepped forward first, pushing the slightly open door with her snout. A long creak echoed, breaking the suffocating silence. Inside, the smell was strong and unpleasant, a mix of mold, dirt, and something even more pungent that made Sarah instinctively cover her nose. Mike, holding his flashlight, took the first step. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice firm, as he scanned the room with the beam of light. The interior was chaotic. Broken furniture scattered around, pieces of torn fabric hanging from the walls, and in the center of the room, an old, dirty blanket. Harley ran straight to the blanket and started digging frantically with her paws, letting out small whimpers of distress. Sarah crouched down to help, but froze when she saw what was hidden underneath. Under the blanket, there was a sixth puppy. Unlike the others, this one wasn't moving. Its small body was weak and cold, and its cry was barely audible. Harley desperately licked the puppy, trying to warm it with her body. Sarah felt a pang in her chest as she watched the scene. "He's still alive, but barely," she said, gently picking up the puppy. "We need to take him to a vet right now." While Sarah comforted Harley, Mike continued searching the cabin. Something about the place deeply unsettled him. He felt like there was more to it than met the eye. Then, shining his flashlight into a dark corner, he saw something that made his heart race. A dusty dog collar, tossed beside a piece of cut rope. As he got closer, he noticed a crumpled piece of paper, covered in mud stains. "Sarah, I think we found something," Mike called, his voice low. Sarah walked over to him, holding the puppy in one hand and petting Harley with the other. When she saw what Mike was holding, a chill ran down her spine. The paper looked like part of a draft or a note, and although most of it was illegible, one clear sentence stood out. "They can't find out." As Sarah stared at the piece of paper, a sense of unease washed over her. "They can't find out." The words echoed in her mind like a dark riddle. Harley, sensing the tense atmosphere, let out a small whimper, still protecting the weaker pup, now wrapped in one of the blankets Sarah had found on the floor. "This isn't just an abandoned cabin," Mike said, glancing around. "Someone's been here recently." Sarah nodded, noticing the shoe prints crossing the dusty floor. They were recent, no doubt about it. Harley remained restless, circling near the door as if she wanted to leave as quickly as possible. Sarah pulled out her phone and tried calling the station, but there was no signal. "We need to take this pup to the vet and look into this more carefully later," Sarah suggested, her voice full of concern. "I agree, but first I want to take a quick look back there," Mike said, pointing to a partially open door leading to another room. Reluctantly, Sarah stayed where she was, holding the pup and trying to calm Harley, who was now licking the other pups on the police car bench, parked near the cabin. Meanwhile, Mike slowly moved toward the back room, his flashlight flickering in the darkness. When he entered, he realized the place was even more unsettling. The room was empty, but the walls were covered in scratch marks, as if an animal or something in panic had tried to escape. On the floor, there was a dirty water bowl and food scraps scattered around, indicating that some animal had been kept captive for days. Mike sighed, feeling the weight of the discovery. "Mike, what's in there?" Sarah shouted from the main room, her voice echoing. "Someone was keeping dogs here," he replied, stepping out of the room with a furrowed brow. "And judging by the state of things, this wasn't too long ago. We need to take this seriously." Harley, as if understanding the urgency, started barking again, looking toward the forest behind the cabin. It was as if the dog was trying to say that the danger hadn't passed yet. Sarah exchanged a tense glance with Mike. "Do you think the person who was here could be nearby?" she asked, her voice low but filled with concern. Mike placed his hand on his holster, gripping the gun tightly. "I'm not ruling out that possibility. Let's get out of here now, but we'll be back. And when we return, we'll bring reinforcements." Without wasting any more time, they put the puppies in the car and headed to the vet. On the way, neither of them spoke, but the tension in the air was palpable. Something was very wrong, and they knew this was just the beginning. The road to the veterinary clinic felt endless. Sarah kept her eyes fixed on the tiny puppy in her hands, whose breathing was so weak it seemed to vanish with each passing second. Harley, sitting in the back seat with the other puppies, let out small, anxious whimpers, as if begging for the survival of the most fragile one. Mike drove in silence, his thoughts racing. The cabin, the scratch marks, the mysterious note. All of it formed a puzzle he couldn't put together. Finally, the clinic's lights appeared ahead, briefly lighting up Sarah's worried face. Once they parked, Sarah hurried out with Harley right behind her. The on-call veterinarian, a middle-aged woman named Dr. Ellen Foster, rushed to greet them. "What happened?" Ellen asked, carefully taking the puppy in her arms. "We found this little one in an abandoned cabin. He's very weak," Sarah replied. "Please, do whatever you can." As Ellen carried the puppy inside, Harley tried to follow, but Sarah gently held her back. "Easy, girl. She'll help him," Mike stood outside, leaning against the squad car, staring into the darkness that surrounded the city. Something about Harley's behavior deeply unsettled him. It was almost as if she knew more than any human about what was happening. "Did you notice how she seemed to guide us there?" he asked Sarah when she returned. "Yeah, but what worries me more is why. Who would leave a dog like that, so devoted, in a place like that? And the note?" Sarah paused, trying to organize her thoughts. "I need to believe that Harley came to us for a reason." At that moment, Mike's phone buzzed. He answered quickly, hoping it was something related to the investigation. The voice on the line was one of the officers from the station. "Mike, are you near the cabin?" asked the voice with noticeable tension. "No, we're at the clinic." "Why?" "We went back there to take another look, and we found tracks around it, leading into the forest. They weren't just human tracks, but also those of large dogs. Something's going on out there." Mike's heart raced. He looked at Sarah, who met his gaze with the same concerned expression. Harley, sitting next to them, let out a low bark, as if she knew the conversation was important. "We're going back," Mike said with determination. Sarah hesitated, looking at the clinic door where the puppies were. But seeing Harley's expression and hearing the urgency in Mike's voice, she agreed. "Okay, but this time we're going prepared." As they returned to the squad car, the weight of the discovery at the cabin seemed to intensify. Whatever was hidden in the forest, they needed to find it, before it was too late. The road to the cabin seemed even darker at night. The patrol car's headlights cast unsettling shadows between the trees, sending chills down Sarah's spine. Harley, sitting in the back seat, was alert, her ears upright and eyes fixed on the darkness outside. It was as if she knew something dangerous was waiting for them. "I have a bad feeling about this," Sarah murmured, gazing out the window as the trees passed quickly. "Me too. But we need to find out what's going on," Mike replied, gripping the steering wheel tightly. As they neared the cabin, the patrol car's lights illuminated a scene that made both of them hold their breath. The door, which had previously been slightly ajar, was now wide open, swaying slightly in the wind. Mike turned off the engine and grabbed his flashlight, exchanging a serious look with Sarah. "Stay close to me," he said, getting out of the car. Harley jumped out right behind them, running toward the cabin without hesitation. Sarah gripped her weapon, feeling her heart race. The tension in the air was almost tangible, and every sound in the forest seemed amplified. The rustling of leaves, the snap of dry branches, and the wind that seemed to whisper dark secrets. Inside the cabin, the scene was even more disturbing than before. The blanket in the center of the room had been removed, and in its place something was drawn on the floor. A roughly drawn circle with marks that looked like scratches, but they formed symbols neither of them recognized. Mike shone the flashlight on the floor and kneeled down to examine it more closely. This wasn't here before. Sarah, who had been watching the shadows around them carefully, took a step back, feeling a shiver run down her spine. Harley, beside Mike, began to growl softly, the deep and threatening sound echoing through the small cabin. Suddenly, a sound from the forest made them turn at the same time. It was a bark, not from Harley, but from another dog, deeper, farther away. Then, another bark joined the first, followed by a third. The forest seemed to come alive with the sounds of dogs, getting closer and closer. "We're not alone," Sarah whispered, trying to stay calm while pointing the flashlight toward the window. Mike quickly stood up, looking at Harley. The dog seemed torn, as if wanting to run into the forest, but also stayed firmly by their side, protecting them. "Whatever this means," Mike said, pointing to the symbols on the floor, "it's not good. We need to get out of here now." But before they could take another step, the sound of breaking branches made them stop. Something, or someone, was quickly approaching along the forest trail, and it didn't seem to be alone. And now, what do you think is approaching the cabin? Let us know in the comments. We want to hear your theories, and if your heart is racing like ours. The shadows of the forest stirred, and Sarah instinctively raised her weapon, pointing it in the direction of the sound. The crackling of branches grew closer, and Harley began barking with an intensity Sarah had never witnessed before. It was a warning and also a cry of desperation. "Whatever is coming, it's not alone," Mike whispered, gripping the flashlight with one hand and his gun holster with the other. Suddenly, 3 figures emerged from the darkness, but they weren't human. They were large dogs, their eyes glowing eerily in the flashlight's beam. Their fur was dirty, and their thin bodies suggested they had been left to survive on their own. Despite appearing hungry, they weren't just looking for food. There was something in their eyes that radiated danger. "Easy, easy," Sarah murmured, trying to hold back Harley, who was charging forward in fury, as if wanting to protect them both. Mike kept the flashlight focused on the dogs, noticing something unusual. They all had similar marks on their necks, like scars from collars that had been too tight. They've been chained. And recently, before they could react, a sharp whistle sliced through the air. The dogs froze, their ears perking up as if waiting for a command. Then, slowly, they retreated into the shadows, disappearing among the trees. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the barking. "Someone is controlling them," Sarah said, out of breath, still holding the gun. Mike looked around, trying to identify the source of the sound. "And that person is watching us." Before they could decide what to do, a faint light flickered in the distance, momentarily illuminating the trail they had come from. Someone was approaching, driving a vehicle that made low sounds, as if the engine were about to stop. "We need to get out of here now," Sarah exclaimed, pulling Mike by the arm. Harley barked again, this time with more urgency, running toward the squad car. It was as if she knew time was running out. The 2 of them ran after her, their hearts pounding like drums in their chests. When they reached the car, Mike started the engine, and the squad car's lights briefly illuminated the trail behind them. For a moment, they saw a lone figure standing between the trees. It was a hooded man, holding something shiny in his hands. He watched them motionless, as the squad car sped down the bumpy road. Sarah looked back, her mind filled with fear and curiosity. "Who is he? What does he want?" Mike gritted his teeth, driving hastily. "Whoever he is, he doesn't want us to find out what's going on in that cabin." As they drove away, Harley let out a soft whine, resting her head on the puppies in the back seat. They were safe for now, but the threat in the forest still surrounded them. Back at the station, the atmosphere was heavy with tension. Mike and Sarah could barely catch their breath after the escape, and Harley's worried gaze, while staying close to the puppies, seemed to mirror the general discomfort. They knew the man in the forest wasn't a coincidence. He was a key piece in a puzzle that was becoming increasingly dark. "We need to figure out who he is," Sarah said, placing the note found in the cabin on the conference table. "Everything starts and ends with this cabin." Mike crossed his arms, studying the note once more. The smudged letters now seemed to mock them, offering incomplete clues. "Protect them," he read aloud. Whoever wrote this knew these puppies were in danger. But from who? Sarah approached a board in the room and began organizing the information they had so far. The cabin, the wild dogs, the symbols etched in the ground. "We have a group of trained dogs, probably abandoned or used for something illegal. A man in the forest controlling them. And a desperate female dog who led us straight to all of this." She looked at Mike. "Harley knows more than we do." At that moment, one of the officers entered the room with a file in hand. "I've got something. We did a search through the region's records. A few years ago, there were reports of dogfights on isolated properties. The investigation never went anywhere, but..." He paused, opening the file. One of the names mentioned was a man named Richard Coleman. He disappeared before they could interrogate him. Mike grabbed the file, reading the information carefully. "Richard Coleman," he murmured. "And does his property still exist?" The officer shook his head. "It was sold, but no one knows who bought it. It seems to be registered under a shell company." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. What if this shell company is just a cover for something bigger? She looked at Harley, who perked up her ears at the sound of her voice. What if she escaped from that place? A silence hung in the room, Harley got up and walked to the window. She stared outside into the darkness of the night, letting out a small whine. It was as if she was trying to say something. "I think she wants to go back," Sarah whispered. Mike nodded slowly, still holding the file. "If Harley is willing to lead us again, this might be our chance to uncover the truth. But we need to be ready. Next time, it might not be so easy to escape." The silence in the room was broken by the sound of a phone ringing. One of the officers answered, but his expression quickly changed. He covered the phone with his hand and looked at Mike. "It's about the veterinary clinic. Something happened." Harley let out a loud bark, as if confirming everyone's fear. The danger was far from over. The patrol car cut through the silent streets of the city, illuminated only by the flashing lights of the police vehicle. The sound of the radio echoed in the cabin, bringing fragments of what had happened at the veterinary clinic. Break-in, missing animals, and masked man were words that seemed like disconnected pieces of a puzzle. Harley was restless in the back seat, alternating between looking at the puppies and the road ahead. Sarah, in the passenger seat, gripped the radio firmly. "Any sign of the intruder?" she asked the officer on the other end. "Negative," came the tired voice. "But we have security cameras. The tech team is on their way to recover them." Arriving at the clinic, the scene was desolate. The glass door was shattered, and the reception area, once organized, now looked like a battlefield. Papers scattered, furniture overturned, and an overwhelming sense of urgency in the air. Sarah went straight to the veterinarian, who was pale and visibly shaken. "They took more puppies," he whispered, "and left this." He handed her a crumpled piece of paper with a single sentence written on it. "Don't interfere." Mike, who had been examining the surroundings, approached holding something he had found near the door. It was a piece of fabric stained with dirt and blood. Whoever did this was injured. This could lead us somewhere. As they continued their investigation, Harley began barking, drawing everyone's attention. She was near the side door, where it seemed something had caught her scent. Sarah ran to her and found tracks marked in the wet dirt. They led toward the alley, but disappeared on the asphalt. He knew where he was going. He planned everything. Sarah looked at Harley. "But what he doesn't know is that now we have an advantage." Mike nodded, focused. "The security camera. As soon as we analyze it, we'll be able to identify the man." As the tech team retrieved the footage, Sarah gently petted Harley, trying to calm her. "You're trying to protect the puppies, aren't you?" "But Harley, why? What's guiding us here?" she whispered, feeling powerless. The answer came faster than they expected. The first image captured by the cameras showed a masked man holding a transport box full of puppies. But it was the last image that froze Sarah and Mike. The man was looking directly at the camera before disappearing into the darkness. His eyes conveyed something more than a threat. It was a warning. "He knows we're after him," Mike said, clenching his fists. As the group returned to the vehicle, Harley stared into the distance. She seemed to know that the battle was far from over. The patrol car moved slowly along the dark trail, illuminated only by the headlights, which cast unsettling shadows between the trees. Harley was in the back seat, alternating between looking at the puppies and staring at the road, as if anticipating something. Sarah couldn't shake the image of the masked man captured by the cameras. Beside her, Mike gripped the steering wheel tightly, his thoughts as dark as the forest around them. They both knew returning to the cabin was risky, but there was no other choice. When they arrived, the cabin looked more menacing than ever. The door was wide open, swaying in the wind, and a heavy silence hung in the air. Harley was the first to get out of the car, cautiously making her way to the entrance. She stopped and started growling quietly, as if warning of an invisible danger. Sarah and Mike, followed by Officers Baker and Jenny, grabbed their flashlights and entered the cabin, feeling the weight of something dark lurking. The inside was different. In the center of the room, where there had been symbols carved before, now there was a new circle, drawn with what appeared to be dried blood. Beside it, a small piece of stained fabric was carefully folded. Harley sniffed the air, her unease growing. Suddenly, she began digging frantically in a corner of the room. Mike and Baker rushed to help her, while Sarah illuminated the area. Under a layer of dirt, they found a wooden box filled with rusted collars, old photos of dogs, and a notebook. Sarah opened the notebook, her hands trembling. The pages were filled with drawings of dogs, scribbles, and disconnected phrases. But on the last page, a clear and disturbing message stood out. They are always watching. Protect them at all costs. As she read those words, Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. Harley let out a deep growl, his eyes fixed on the broken window of the cabin. The sound of a branch snapping outside made everyone turn quickly, weapons in hand. The tension filled the air. Outside, the sound of footsteps seemed to be getting closer, mixed with the rustling of leaves. Mike signaled for everyone to remain silent while he tried to discern what was happening. Harley kept growling, his posture rigid as if he was ready to protect the group. Suddenly, a faint light appeared between the trees, accompanied by a figure moving slowly. The air grew even heavier, and everyone felt they were being watched. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and silence returned, as suffocating as before. Mike exchanged a tense glance with Sarah and murmured, "Whoever it is, they're testing us." Before they could make a decision, a new sound, more distant, echoed through the forest. It was a long, sharp whistle like a command. Harley barked fiercely, but the sense of danger only grew. They knew they would need all their courage to face what was coming. The dim light guided them through the forest, but the tension in the air was almost unbearable. Harley led the way, his intermittent barks signaling that something was wrong. Sarah and Mike stayed close, with Officers Baker and Jenny right behind them, each holding their weapons. The shadows seemed to come to life, and the sounds of the forest created the impression they were being surrounded. Every step they took seemed to lead them deeper into territory that wasn't theirs. When they reached a clearing, the sight that awaited them made the group freeze. In the center, a partially extinguished campfire still released faint smoke. Around it were dirty bowls, rusted collars, and scattered ropes. But what caught their attention most was the symbol carved into the ground, similar to the one they had found at the cabin. It was a complex circle, drawn with precision, as if it held a meaning that eluded their understanding. Harley stopped at the edge of the symbol, growling deeply. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps interrupted the silence, and a man emerged from the shadows. He wore a worn-out coat with a hood and held a chain in one hand. His eyes gleamed in the dim light of the lanterns, and he seemed strangely calm. "I warned you not to interfere," he said, his voice low but filled with threat. Mike stepped forward, his weapon aimed. "Who are you? What are you doing with these dogs?" he asked, trying to stay in control. The man let out a brief, bitter laugh. "You'll never understand. They need to be protected. From you." Before they could react, he whistled loudly, and the sound of breaking branches echoed through the forest around them. Sarah swung the lantern, revealing bright eyes between the trees. They were large, thin, but fierce dogs, now surrounding the group. Harley, however, didn't back down. She stood between the group and the dogs, barking protectively. The man slowly retreated into the darkness, but not before saying, "You can't save them. Not now. Not from me," and he vanished into the trees, leaving the group surrounded by the dogs. Mike aimed his gun, but before he could act, Harley charged forward, barking so fiercely that the dogs hesitated. It was then that Sarah realized Harley wasn't just guiding the group, she was protecting them at all costs. Harley growled once more, and the dogs slowly retreated, disappearing into the darkness. The group stood in silence for a few moments as the sound of footsteps faded away. "He's running, but it's not over," Mike said, breaking the silence. Sarah nodded, looking at Harley, who returned to them, panting but with a determined look. "She brought us here for a reason, and now we know whoever is behind this won't stop. But neither will we." The group began to pull back, aware that the confrontation with the man was inevitable, but with renewed certainty. Harley and her puppies were the key to uncovering everything. If this story kept you hooked, leave a like and share it with anyone who loves emotional stories like this. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel See you next time.